The Prince and the Pauper, written by the Disney Book Group, illustrated by the Disney storybook artists. Once upon a time, there was a wise and good king. He ruled with kindness, and his people were happy. But one day, the king became ill. Pete, the captain of the king's guards, saw this as a chance to make himself rich. He taxed the poorest subjects and stole their food. Everyone feared him. One of the poorest and hungriest subjects was named Mickey. All day long, he tried to sell ice cream cones on the streets of London with the help of his dog Pluto and his best friend Goofy. Few Londoners wanted ice cream in the winter, but Mickey never got discouraged. He was sure that one day they would live like kings with a warm fire and lots of food to eat. Suddenly, the royal coach came racing down the street. Inside, Captain Pete and his henchmen laughed as they ate the food they had stolen from the peasants. As the coach bounced by, sausages fell out of a bag attached to the back. Pluto barked and chased the sausages all the way through the castle gates, which slammed shut behind him. Mickey pounded on the gate. A surprised guard let him in, addressing him as if he were the prince. Captain Pete overheard, pointed to a lighted window and asked, "Then who's that up there?" In the window, they could see the silhouette of someone who looked exactly like Mickey. Inside the castle, the real prince was sitting through a boring lesson with his old tutor, Horace. Bored, the prince pulled out his royal marble shooter and fired it at his servant, Donald. Donald fired back, but instead of hitting the prince, he hit Horace. Horace scolded Donald, but was interrupted by a loud crash in the castle courtyard. The prince ran to the window. Below him, Captain Pete had caught Mickey and Pluto. "Captain," the prince shouted, "my father needs his peace and quiet." The captain said Mickey and Pluto were just riffraff, but the prince told him that all subjects deserve respect and wanted to meet them. "As you wish," Captain Pete replied. When the prince turned away, Captain Pete kicked Mickey through the air. The guard scooped Mickey up and shoved him into the castle, shutting the door behind him. Inside the castle, Mickey was amazed by how warm it was and by the shiny suits of armor and crystal chandeliers. He could even see his reflection in the polished floor. He kicked up his heels and danced a jig. Clang! Mickey bumped into a suit of armor. The helmet fell off and landed on his head. Because he couldn't see, he bumped into another suit of armor, then another. The prince ran downstairs to see what was happening. A helmet from a suit of armor crashed onto his head, then he crashed into Mickey. They both raised the grills of their helmets and were surprised to find that they looked exactly alike. The prince thanked Mickey for saving him from his lesson. "I was about to die of boredom until you interrupted. Do you know what it's like to be a prince? I never have time for fun." He wished he could take Mickey's place for a day. He picked up Mickey's hat and put it on. "What a great idea," he said. "I'll take your place in the streets, and you will be a prince." Mickey didn't like that idea. He didn't know how to be a prince, but the prince said it was easy. All Mickey would have to say was, "Splendid!" and "Guards, seize him!" Besides, it would only be for a day. The prince and Mickey traded clothes, and the prince climbed out of the window, careful to avoid Captain Pete. Plop! The prince landed in a snowbank. He got up and dusted himself off, but Pluto knocked him down, licking his face. Pluto thought he was Mickey, but not for long. He knew this wasn't his master. Goofy, it turned out, was easier to fool. "Hiya, Mickey," he said. The prince just smiled, nodded, and hurried away. At that moment, the real Mickey was trying to concentrate on his lessons, but his mind kept wandering to food. Horace asked Mickey all sorts of questions, but Mickey couldn't answer anything correctly. Meanwhile, the prince was learning lessons of his own about life outside the castle. First, he joined a group of children who were having a snowball fight. At first, he took great joy in it, but he soon grew tired of being hit in the face with snow. Then the prince escaped the snowball fight and came upon a pack of dogs. He had heard that dogs enjoyed playing fetch, but when the prince tried to pick up a dog's bone, he found himself running from the whole pack. He ducked into a dark alley and waited until the dogs ran past. At the castle, Mickey wanted to show Horace and Donald that he was just as smart as the prince. But during a potion-making lesson, he mixed the wrong ingredients and the recipe backfired, right into Donald's face. Finally, Mickey's luck began to improve. He did very well in his sword-fighting lesson and in taming a wild falcon. Back in the village, the prince emerged from the alley to find himself in the middle of a fight. A peasant lady was trying to stop Pete's henchman from stealing her last chicken. "Halt!" the prince cried, and commanded the guards to let the chicken go. They took one look at him and laughed. "I think you forgot your crown," one guard said, then smashed a pumpkin onto the prince's head. "I can't believe it," said the prince. "Stealing in the king's name." The prince was still standing in the street when a big open wagon filled with food came clattering down the street. "Make way for the royal provisioner!" the driver shouted. The townspeople ran, but the prince jumped directly in front of the oncoming horse. He held up his royal ring and commanded the driver to surrender the food. The driver gasped and stopped the wagon as the crowd knelt before the prince. The prince climbed aboard and tossed food down to the peasants. Moments later, Pete's guards arrived. "You there!" one shouted. "You're under!" Smack! A huge leg of lamb hit the guard in the face. "Hang on, Mick!" Goofy hollered, knocking barrels into the guards who had surrounded the prince. As the guards scattered, Goofy snatched up the prince and jumped into the cart, which sped away. Back at the castle, Mickey had just received some bad news. The king was in his last hours and wished to see him at once. If the king died before the prince came back, Mickey would be crowned king. How would he ever act like a king? Mickey thought, "I'll explain everything. The king will understand." But it wasn't that easy. "My son," a soft voice called when he entered the king's room. "Come closer." Mickey took the king's outstretched hand and said, "Your Highness." Mickey knew he needed to find the prince. He would want to say goodbye to his father. Suddenly, the sheets flew aside. Captain Pete was in the king's bed. Pete grabbed Mickey and told him the king was dead. "And if you don't do everything I say," he pointed toward a corner where Pluto was tied up with a heavy rope. Pete knew Mickey wasn't the real prince. Before Mickey could speak, he heard the sound of church bells tolling the king's death. From Goofy's home on London Bridge, the prince also heard the bells. He knew they meant that his father was dead, and it was time for him to help his people. Goofy and the prince returned to the castle, but they did not get far. Captain Pete was waiting right outside. Goofy did his best to defend the prince, but this time it wasn't enough. The guards surrounded the prince and forced him out the door. The guards threw the prince into the castle dungeon with Donald. "Your Highness, we're saved!" Donald cried, throwing his arms around the prince. But the door to the dungeon clanged shut. "Wait a minute," Donald cried. "They've captured you too? We're doomed!" While the prince and Donald sat in their cell, the sound of music filled the air. The kingdom was preparing for the coronation of a new king. Mickey gulped as he entered the church. He did not know what to do. He didn't want to be king, but he had no choice. He had to obey Captain Pete or risk Pluto getting hurt. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, a dark shadow slid toward the prince's cell. He was holding an axe and wore a hood over his eyes. The executioner! He took a step forward, and then another. Just then, he tripped over a bucket. The axe flew out of his hand and landed inches above the guard's head. "Yup, sorry," came the voice beneath the hood. As the executioner pried the axe out of the wall, the handle came down on the guard's head with a thwack. The guard slumped to the floor, and the executioner tore off his hood. "Goofy!" the prince cried. "Gosh," Goofy said. He pulled a giant keyring from his pocket. "I'll have ya out of there in a jiffy." As Goofy fumbled with the keys, Captain Pete's guards stomped toward them. Donald grabbed the keys from Goofy, trying each one. Finally, there was a click, and the door swung open. In the coronation hall, time was running out. Unless Mickey did something soon, he would be crowned king, and Captain Pete would continue to steal from his subjects. The Archbishop was about to place the crown on Mickey's head when Captain Pete and his guard raced into the room. "Stop!" Mickey shouted, and ordered the guards to seize Captain Pete. "Seize him," said Pete, pointing to Mickey. "He's an imposter." But before the guards could seize anyone, a regal voice declared, "He may be an imposter, but I'm not, Captain." All eyes turned to the ceiling, where the prince leaped from a perch, grabbed hold of the chandelier, and flew down to the ground. "Wait a minute, Your Majesty," said Pete. "I can explain everything." "Very well, go ahead," said the prince. But instead of speaking, Pete struck at the prince with his sword. The prince blocked the blow with his own sword. He sliced at Pete's pants, which fell down around the captain's ankles. The crowd laughed as Captain Pete ran from the castle. The Archbishop looked from Mickey to the prince. Which one was which? Just then, Goofy, Pluto, and Donald entered the hall, and Pluto bounded over to his master. "I guess there's no fooling you, boy," Mickey said. At long last, the Archbishop placed the crown on the prince's head. His subjects cheered, "Long live the king!" And so he did. With his loyal companions Mickey, Goofy, and Pluto at his side, the new king ruled his kingdom just as his father had. And the people lived happily in peace once more. The end.